Have you ever walked into a place you thought you knew, only to have it suddenly feel completely different? That's exactly what happened to me last Saturday. I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary. I just wanted to grab a cup of coffee and lose myself in the pages of a book for an hour. But then, out of nowhere, someone from my past showed up in a way I never could have anticipated. And what he told me that day, well, it stayed with me longer than I could have imagined. Before we dive into the story, I have to ask, which cities are you watching us from today? Drop your city in the comments. I love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. And if you enjoy stories that make you pause, reflect, and maybe even smile a little, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It really helps us continue sharing these little pieces of life. So, let's begin. It was a quiet morning in my neighborhood, the kind where the sun peeks softly over the rooftops, spilling gold across the sidewalks. I love mornings like that, when everything feels calm, like the world is holding its breath for just a moment. I had decided to visit the little independent bookstore that sat on the corner of Maple and 7th. It wasn't far from my house, but it had a charm that made it worth the walk. The smell of old pages, the wooden shelves polished from years of hands brushing against them, and the soft hum of jazz playing from a corner speaker. I wandered down the aisles, my fingers grazing spines of books, as if I could absorb their stories through touch alone. There's something meditative about it, something grounding. I wasn't looking for anything specific, just letting the books find me. Then I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. "Jenna?" The voice was familiar, yet I couldn't place it immediately. I turned slowly, and there he was, Ethan, my neighbor's cousin. We had met briefly at a summer barbecue a few years ago, but I had never spent any significant time with him. He had that easy, unassuming smile, the kind that made you feel like he genuinely wanted to know you, not just make small talk. And there was a softness in his eyes, something thoughtful that caught me off guard. "Ethan, wow, it's been, 3 years?" I said, feeling a warmth that surprised me. I hadn't expected to see anyone I knew that day. He nodded, a small laugh escaping him. "Yeah, 3 years. I didn't think I'd run into you here. I come to this bookstore sometimes, but it's not often." We moved toward each other, careful not to bump into a nearby display of travel guides. There was a natural ease in our conversation, as if the years hadn't created distance at all. We talked about trivial things at first, the weather, the neighborhood, how life had been treating us. But there was an undercurrent, a quiet intensity in the way he listened. He asked questions that weren't just polite, they were meaningful. I found myself telling him about my mornings like this, how I enjoyed getting lost in the pages of a book, how it was my little ritual to slow down life for just an hour or two. And then, almost without realizing it, he shared something about himself, about how he had recently started writing, how he struggled to find words sometimes, but when he did, they felt like tiny sparks of truth. I paused, looking at him in the soft morning light that filtered through the bookstore windows. I realized then that this wasn't just a casual encounter. There was a connection here, subtle but undeniable, built on shared vulnerabilities and unspoken understanding. He wasn't just a neighbor's cousin I had seen once. He was someone who could see beneath the surface of my everyday life, someone who could hold space for my thoughts without judgment. For a long moment, we just stood there, surrounded by books and the faint aroma of coffee from the cafe next door. Then he leaned slightly closer and said something simple, yet it carried a weight I couldn't have anticipated. He told me that he admired the way I approached life, the way I carried myself, the little ways I found joy in ordinary moments. That it wasn't the loud achievements or grand gestures that made life meaningful, but the quiet, intentional acts of presence. I was struck by the sincerity of his words. In that moment, something shifted inside me. It was as if someone had noticed the part of me I usually kept tucked away, the part that loved slow mornings, honest conversations, and finding beauty in small things. And more than that, he acknowledged it in a way that felt profoundly validating. We ended up wandering the aisles together, discussing books we loved, laughing at passages we both found amusing, and occasionally falling into thoughtful silences. There was no rush, no agenda, just two people existing in a space that felt safe, welcoming, and unexpectedly intimate in the most human way. By the time I left the bookstore, my heart felt lighter, and my mind buzzed with reflection. Meeting Ethan wasn't just a chance encounter. It was a reminder of the richness that exists in connections we don't see coming, in moments that are unplanned yet deeply meaningful. That day, I realized that sometimes life surprises you with a reminder that someone out there sees you, not for who you appear to be, but for who you truly are inside. And though I didn't know it then, that morning at the bookstore would mark the beginning of a story that would stay with me, quietly but insistently, for a long time to come. After that morning at the bookstore, I found myself thinking about Ethan more than I expected. It wasn't just the surprise of seeing him again. It was the way our conversation had felt so effortless, like a quiet current running beneath the surface of ordinary words. I started noticing small things in my daily life and imagining what it would be like to share them with him, and I felt a strange mix of anticipation and calm, as if I had discovered a small, secret pocket of connection in the world. A few days later, we bumped into each other again, this time at the farmer's market. I was browsing the apples, squinting against the morning sun, when I heard that familiar voice. "Kenna, didn't expect to see you here." He was holding a basket that looked surprisingly full for someone who usually said he didn't cook much. There was a quiet humor in his expression, and I realized I was smiling before I even spoke. "Seems like fate has a sense of humor," I said, laughing lightly. "I'm just grabbing a few things for the week." He nodded, tilting his basket slightly. "Me too. I've been thinking about our bookstore conversation. It's rare to meet someone who talks about life the way you do, slowly, thoughtfully. Makes a person want to slow down too." I felt a warmth spread through me, a mixture of pleasure and curiosity. He had a way of observing without imposing, noticing things that went beyond small talk. It wasn't flirtation exactly. It was a shared recognition, a quiet intimacy that didn't need labels to be meaningful. We decided to walk together through the stalls, our conversation meandering just like the paths we followed. He told me about a book he had been reading about life in small towns, about how routines and relationships shape us more than we often realize. I told him about the neighborhood cat I had been feeding, who had a stubborn streak but reminded me every day to appreciate the small joys. There was something deeply comforting about this rhythm, the ease of speaking, listening, pausing. By the time we parted ways, I felt lighter, as if a small piece of my life had been acknowledged in a way that mattered. Over the next few weeks, we continued to see each other in unexpected places. At the library, he would be browsing the history section when I wandered in for novels. At the local cafe, he seemed to appear when I needed a quiet corner for my morning tea. Each encounter was casual yet deliberate, a dance of timing and shared presence. One afternoon, he invited me to join him for a community lecture at the town hall, a talk on local history, something I normally wouldn't have considered attending. I agreed, more out of curiosity than anything else. But as we sat together in the wooden chairs, listening to stories of our town's past, I felt a connection growing that went beyond conversation. We shared glances at particularly striking anecdotes, laughed quietly at the lecturer's dry humor, and even borrowed each other's notes. It was a kind of companionship I hadn't experienced in a long time. Gentle, affirming, and deeply human. After the lecture, we walked back toward the main street, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the pavement. Ethan spoke quietly, almost to himself, about the importance of acknowledging the small details in life, the kind of details that often go unnoticed, but define our sense of belonging. "I think," he said finally, "that people underestimate the power of noticing. Noticing others, noticing yourself. It changes the way you move through the world. I looked at him, the sunlight highlighting the thoughtful curve of his smile. I've noticed that too, I admitted. Sometimes, just being seen. It's enough to make a difference. There was a pause then, not awkward, but charged with the quiet realization that we were both acknowledging something significant, something that didn't need to be spelled out. I felt a stirring of gratitude for his presence, for the way he had entered my life not as a dramatic disruption, but as a steady, subtle force, a reminder that connection can exist in its simplest, most unassuming form. By the time we reached the corner where our paths diverged, neither of us was in a rush to say goodbye. He hesitated for a moment, then spoke, his voice low but sincere. "I'm glad I found you that day in the bookstore," he said. "It's rare to meet someone who makes the ordinary feel meaningful." I nodded, feeling an ache of recognition in my chest. "I feel the same way," I said. "It's not just about the books or the streets we walk. It's about the moments we share along the way." And then, with a gentle smile and a wave, we parted ways, carrying with us the quiet knowledge that something had begun. Something unspoken, yet unmistakably real. That evening, I sat by my window with a cup of tea, watching the sun dip below the rooftops. I realized that life's surprises often arrive not in grand gestures, but in the steady accumulation of small, meaningful encounters. Ethan's words, his presence, the simple way he acknowledged the world and me. It stayed with me, like a soft echo that made the ordinary feel extraordinary. That night, I reflected on the unexpected turns life can take. It made me wonder how many connections we pass by unnoticed, how many opportunities for understanding and companionship lie just around the corner, waiting for us to notice. And I knew that, for me, something important had shifted. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way anyone else might see, but deep inside, where it counted the most. It was a rainy afternoon when I realized how much I had started anticipating my encounters with Ethan. I had been at the grocery store, debating over which tea to buy, when I saw him through the sliding glass doors. He was holding a canvas bag and glancing at the produce section, his brow slightly furrowed, as if calculating the ripeness of the tomatoes. "Jenna," he called, waving as he approached. The warmth in his voice made the chill in the air feel less biting. I laughed softly, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "I guess the rain didn't stop you from shopping either." "Nope," he said. "I thought I might as well make the most of it. Besides, there's something comforting about being surrounded by food on a rainy day. Don't you think?" There was something so unassuming about the way he spoke that it drew me in. I realized again how rare it was to meet someone whose presence could make even the most ordinary moments feel meaningful. We walked through the aisles together, discussing the merits of different kinds of apples and sharing small anecdotes about our week. There was laughter, but also long stretches of silence that felt natural, not forced, silences in which I could sense a mutual understanding growing stronger. Later, we decided to sit in a nearby cafe. The rain was falling steadily outside, casting rippling shadows on the wooden floor. I ordered a cup of chamomile tea, and he chose coffee, the aroma mixing with the scent of wet earth drifting in from the street. We watched the rain for a few minutes in companionable quiet, and I realized how rare it was to experience this kind of calm with someone. "You know," he began, his voice thoughtful, "I've been thinking a lot about perspective lately. How easy it is to get caught up in life's routines and forget to notice the small moments that actually matter." I nodded. It's true. I've always loved quiet mornings like the ones at the bookstore, but lately I've started noticing the way people interact, the little gestures that reveal who they really are. He smiled, a little shyly, and I felt that familiar stirring again, the quiet thrill of realizing that someone truly sees you, the kind of recognition that isn't just about being acknowledged, but about being understood. We talked for hours, though it didn't feel like it. We shared memories from our childhoods, stories about our families, and reflections on life's unexpected turns. I told him about my late mother's love for old novels, and he recounted afternoons spent at his grandfather's workshop, learning to repair clocks. There was a rhythm to our conversation, a give and take that felt like an old dance we had both forgotten but were rediscovering together. At one point, he leaned back in his chair, looking out the window at the rain-slicked street. "It's strange," he said quietly, "how sometimes you meet someone, and it feels like they're exactly the person you needed to encounter at that moment. Not because they change your life, necessarily, but because they remind you of who you are." His words resonated deeply with me. I realized that he had done exactly that. He had reminded me of my own quiet joys, of the parts of myself I sometimes neglected in the rush of daily life. There was a depth in our connection that went beyond surface-level conversation, a subtle intimacy built on recognition, trust, and shared observation. After the rain eased and the cafe began to fill with the soft buzz of other patrons, we reluctantly stood to leave. Outside, the street glistened with puddles, and the air smelled of wet asphalt and fresh beginnings. We walked together for a while, letting the silence speak for us, until we reached the corner where our paths diverged once more. "I'm really glad we ran into each other today," he said, his voice steady but warm. "These moments, they matter more than we often realize." I smiled, feeling a profound sense of gratitude. "They do. And I'm grateful too. For the conversation, for the quiet, for everything." As I walked home, I reflected on how my life had subtly shifted since that first encounter at the bookstore. It wasn't a dramatic change, nothing that anyone else might notice, but inside me, something had realigned. I felt lighter, more aware, more present. The world seemed richer, not because it had changed, but because I had begun to notice it differently. That evening, I pulled a book from my shelf, the very one I had been browsing when I first saw Ethan, and opened it to a random page. I read a passage and thought about the simplicity of meaningful connections, about how they can arrive unexpectedly and quietly, yet leave a lasting imprint. Ethan's words, his attention, and the way he made space for me, they stayed with me, lingering like the faint echo of a favorite melody. And as I sat there by the window, watching the last streaks of rain glimmer in the streetlights, I realized something important. The moments that leave the deepest impressions are often the ones that seem ordinary at first. They are quiet encounters, gentle conversations, shared silences, and the recognition that someone else truly sees you. It's in these moments that we discover the subtle, enduring beauty of connection, the kind that quietly shapes who we are and who we are becoming. It was early evening when I found myself walking down Maple Street, the air crisp and fragrant with the hint of autumn leaves. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting long, golden shadows across the sidewalks. I had been thinking about Ethan all day, about the quiet way he had entered my life, and the subtle ways he had changed how I noticed the world around me. I didn't know if he felt the same, but there was a certainty in my own heart that something important had begun. I spotted him at the corner of the little park near my house. He was sitting on a bench, sketchbook open on his lap, the tip of his pencil moving slowly across the page. He looked up when he saw me, and his face lit with that same warm, easy smile that had made the first encounter at the bookstore so memorable. "Jenna," he said, standing to greet me. "I didn't think you'd be up this early." "I needed a walk," I admitted, "and it seems like the perfect evening for it." We walked together along the winding paths of the park, the crunch of leaves underfoot, and the distant laughter of children, creating a soft backdrop to our conversation. There was a natural rhythm to our steps, a comfortable silence that didn't feel empty but full of shared understanding. "I've been thinking," he said after a while, his voice gentle, "about how rare it is to meet someone who feels like an answer without having asked a question. Someone who reminds you of things you didn't realize you'd forgotten." I smiled softly. "That's exactly how I've felt, too. It's like discovering a quiet corner of yourself you didn't know was there." We found a bench by the pond, where the water mirrored the sky's fading colors. Ducks glided across the surface, leaving gentle ripples in their wake. I realized then how much I had come to value these moments with him, not for anything dramatic, but for the depth of presence they offered. Each conversation, each pause, each shared glance had been a thread weaving a sense of belonging and understanding between us. "I want you to know," he continued, "that meeting you, it's made me more aware of the world around me, of small gestures, quiet moments, and the beauty of noticing. You've reminded me of the importance of paying attention, not just to life, but to the people in it." His words were simple, yet profound. I felt a lump in my throat, not from sadness or longing, but from the overwhelming clarity of connection, the realization that sometimes life gifts you people who change you in the most subtle, enduring ways. "I felt the same," I said, my voice soft. "More than I realized at first. You've reminded me to slow down, to notice, to really see." We sat together for a while longer, speaking occasionally, letting the quiet of the evening fill the spaces between our words. There was no need to rush, no need to define what this was. It existed in the small things, the shared attention, the mutual respect, the gentle acknowledgement of each other's presence. Eventually, the sky deepened into shades of indigo, and the first stars began to twinkle above. We stood, lingering near the pond, neither of us wanting to end the moment. "Thank you," I said finally, "for noticing me, for sharing these moments with me." He smiled, a quiet, genuine smile that carried warmth and understanding. "And thank you, Jenna, for being here, for being present, and for reminding me that life's small, quiet moments are often the most meaningful." We walked together to the edge of the park, where the streets branched off in different directions. There was a sense of completion, not in the form of an ending, but in the feeling that something had been firmly planted, an awareness, a connection, a subtle but powerful reminder of life's richness. As I turned toward my own street, I realized that this experience with Ethan had left a lasting mark on me, not because of any grand declaration, but because of the quiet acknowledgement of each other's lives, the shared understanding, and the gentle companionship that had grown over weeks of chance encounters. Later that night, I sat by my window with a notebook and pen, writing down the thoughts and feelings that had emerged over the past weeks. I wrote about the bookstore, the farmer's market, the rainy afternoons, and the quiet park evenings. I wrote about noticing, about connection, about the subtle beauty of someone who sees you for who you truly are. And as I finished writing, I felt a profound sense of gratitude. Life had surprised me in a gentle, unexpected way, reminding me that meaningful encounters don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they arrive quietly, softly, like a whispered truth, leaving you changed forever, not in dramatic gestures, but in the delicate shaping of your heart and mind. Ethan's presence in my life had reminded me that the ordinary can hold extraordinary meaning, that a shared glance, a thoughtful word, or a quiet conversation can be more transformative than any grand event. And as I closed my notebook and watched the moon rise over the rooftops, I knew that this story, our story, would remain with me quietly, profoundly, and beautifully for a long time to come.